In the last video, I went into the basics of some color application using the dye-based inks on glossy cardstock, using a scene that I had stamped out in black ink for the main composition, which is the Lakeside Cove, and I inked around the perimeter of these two moon impressions, which is the cloud with moon. I talked about, after I got through adding these, layering down all of these colors on here, I talked about adding some special effects, adding some highlighting with some white gel pen dots, and I thought I'd go into that in this little video right here. I'll talk about it more later on, but again, as I'm doing these videos, it occurs to me, that I should probably be talking about some certain things while I'm on the subject, and I don't know, I thought I'd get right into this. Now, most of the times when we're working with inks and paper, we're doing a positive process in terms of adding something onto something else. When we're adding on these inks onto the scenes, onto the glossy cardstock, we're using dye-based inks, which are transparent inks. So basically, the more inks that you add onto something, the darker it's going to get. Where I might lose out on some of the things that were happening in the scene before I inked it in is I might lose some of the lighting that exists on there by stamping onto a white piece of paper. A good way to go back into these scenes now, and a way to add targeted lighting, is to go back in and reintroduce the whiteness of the page. Now, I'm not going to be removing any ink, but with the advent of these white gel pens several years ago, we're able to do that now. And it's a way that I like to go in and kind of, I don't know, finish off the process. When these designs are being drawn, they're being drawn with a dark black dot with technical pens in black ink. And it just seems like a natural thing to kind of finish the finished scene off utilizing all these different stamps with that same convention of a dot, but in its reverse, its complement. Okay, now I'm looking at this scene right here, and we have the illuminating sources in the scene, which is the moon and the reflection. Looking at these trees right here, I mean, I can see the silhouette of them. Same thing with the larger spruce tree down below. I can see them just fine there, but a way to kind of bring them out even more against the background is to introduce a little bit of lighting into it. Now, this is a white gel pen by Uniball. A lot of times if you've bought gel pens in the past, sometimes, and it happened to me too, sometimes you get these different types of gel pens, and they clog up on you, or they just don't last, or you get one use out of them. I bought several different brands of pens in the past, and sometimes even brand new they didn't work, but I've always had really good luck with the Uniballs. Anyways, what I'm doing right here, and this is I hope this can read on the video, but these little white gel pen dots are being added to the trees. The trees on the right side of the scene, I'm adding some highlights on the left sides of them to kind of pick up the lighting coming from the moon. On this side of the scene, the illuminating source will be to their right. So I'm going to add the gel pen dots primarily on the right side of these trees. Okay. And again, I'm not sure if this is going to be reading or not. I hope I can get a close-up of this. I'm looking for other opportunities on the scene for additional highlights. And the highlights also add a nice texture to these areas that you're adding them into. I can see these rocks down here in the scene. I'm thinking about maybe picking up some highlights. Some of that moonlight might be shining on some of these rocks right here. And what I'm doing right here is I'm not just kind of adding these little dots perfectly spaced out. In other words, like 1/4 inch apart from each other across the entire area. But maybe in just some of the lighter areas, I add more highlights, and in some of the darker areas, like this rock down here, maybe it's in the shade, so it doesn't have as many highlights. So I might just put a couple little dots on there to kind of bring that out. And there you have it there. Like I said, I'm not sure if this is going to read or not, but we'll see how it goes. Some of these areas out here on the perimeter, now that's supposed to be a cloudy area, and it's probably a cloudy sky, but just to add a little bit of visual interest in there, a lot of times I'll add like little stars if it's a nighttime type of scene, if it's a daytime scene with the light shining from the middle, maybe these little bits of texture by way of dots, maybe those would represent something like, some little sparkles in the sky, light beam, whatnot. Okay, here's some spruce trees down here. The light is shining from these two areas right here. I'll put some little dots on the side of these trees, the left-hand side, just to kind of bring it out from the background. With these pens here too, they'll dry just fine and stand out against the dark background. But if at any point in time you ever add something that you just don't like, you can always take a paper towel, or you can rub it out with your finger, and it just buffs right out. Okay? It doesn't mean that it's it's gonna fall off the surface, but it does sit on the surface nicely to where you can take it out if you don't like it. And I don't know, sometimes I've added just too many and I've had to take them off before. Always kind of hold your card out at a distance to see what type of effect something like these little highlights we're having. If you have a real dark scene, that would probably represent less light shining in your scene, so maybe you would, these dots would really stand out against a super dark background, so maybe you wouldn't really add too many of these in there. Sometimes it looks strange. Light reflecting off the water's surface. You can have a little sparkles of water, and sometimes I like to cluster these up a little bit. Okay, now what this is doing, and this is what I really like about these little highlights in here, is it kind of pulls the different objects away from the backgrounds, away from, the different layers of distance that's being represented in here. So you have these trees against a cloudy, moonlit sky. It brings those trees out from the background and pushes the moon back a little bit visually. And that's the same thing that's going on down here. These trees are being pulled out from the background a little bit more by the use of value and texture. But the thing about that is that we have the same texture running through the sky, the midground, foreground. So while it's being separated in terms of, it's a separating element in terms of distance, but texturally, having that same element running through all of these different spaces, it unifies it with the use of texture. Okay, so now that's a crisp, an example of a crisp texture being used on a scene to embellish it. And what I also like to do is I like to bring in kind of a soft element into my scenes. This is a white Pigment Ink Pad, and this is just your typical cotton swab. And this is the way I go in and I add kind of a foggy look to my scenes. Now this is one of the things that I always get questions about, is how do you add fog, and a lot of times, in the past I've always had just step-by-step progression lessons, and it's hard to kind of, show what's happening in this process right here. But it's dabbing down onto the scene layers of white pigment ink, you know, on top of this glossy cardstock. Now, if you've ever tried to stamp something out in a pigment ink onto glossy cardstock, you know that it doesn't dry, okay? But what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be layering very thin layers of this ink down, and it sets up just fine, and it dries fine. This one's not a fast drying ink, it's a slower drying ink, but the way I'm going to be using it is in a very light touch and in a very thin layer. Okay, this is what not to do. Then this is what people have asked me about in the past. If they've had a cotton swab and they've dabbed in full of ink, a lot of times when they start dabbing it on, it's at its wettest point right after you ink it up naturally. And when they start dabbing it down, they're getting big balls of white ink everywhere. Not what you want. Okay, but like I said, just like the white gel pen, if you don't like it, it buffs right out. You don't need to worry about it, so it gives you time to address what you don't want on there. So what I'm going to do, now let me see, I'm going to dab this off on this piece of paper, but let me take this blotter paper, this example that I was doing on a previous scene. And if you can see what I'm doing here, I'm kind of dabbing off a lot of this ink right here. And what that's doing is it's removing some of the ink, and at the same time it's kind of smashing this cotton swab down a little bit more. It's not as tight of a ball, okay? And that's what I want. I want a kind of a loose, soft applicator and a fairly dry ink on there. It's kind of like dry brushing onto your scene. Okay, now where would I add this? All right. Now, when we're stamping out imagery, rubber stamp imagery, you know, you ink these things up, you stamp it down, you want real crisp images. I mean, that's the idea of getting a good impression, right? But one of the things that I like to do is I love texture in artwork or whatever. You know, having a range of it. I like something crisp, I like contrasts. And this is a way to go back in and introduce kind of an element of softness. So if you have something like an illumination in your scene, it could be stars, in this case it's a moon, I can go in with this and kind of add a different light to an area. Here you see this moon is really crisp down here, and right here it's a little bit softer because I've diffused it a little bit around the edge, and I've lightened up that perimeter. And like I said, if you don't like it, you just wipe it right off, okay? You can even do it after it dries. It'll buff out if you don't like it. Here's some clouds down here. Clouds are made out of vapor. Why not introduce kind of a softer edge around here? Now, for this white ink to really be effective, you have to have left some of the lightness of your white piece of paper. If you try doing it out here, it looks funny. It stands out because what this is supposed to represent is kind of moisture in the air being illuminated by something, okay? But if there's no illumination, such as in the shadows, then you wouldn't be able to see that moisture or whatever might be in the air. Dust could be, you know, or anything like that. Okay. And like I said, I'm not sure if this is going to be reading at all in this video or not. But anyway, at least you'll be able to kind of get the gist of what the application of it might look like. Okay. All right. Let me see if you can pick this out a little bit. Okay, I've kind of dabbed out around this cloud, but not done it up here. All right. Maybe you can see a little bit of the difference there. Okay, you can kind of apply some around in here. A lot of times the best applicator for this also is if you've added too much, I just kind of dab it off with my finger and it removes some of that ink. Okay, and I don't know if you've seen a lake, like maybe early in the morning. Maybe it wouldn't show at nighttime, but sometimes you see a little mist rising off a lake. Sometimes I like to add that into these areas, maybe kind of where light meets shadow. I might have some of the mist kind of forming around some of these rocks. And like I said, I like how it's extending the textural range of the scene by introducing this. And like I said, you know, there's a lot of times, you know, when it comes to stamping, there's not a lot of textural range in terms of achieving kind of softer looks. And this really allows me to do that, and it also allows me to add lines.